Welcome to David's Ships. In this video I continue with the construction of the 1 in 350 scale Schwerer Gustav kit. To watch other videos in this build series, follow the link to the playlist in the cards above. Today's video is all about decals. Lots of decals. Lots of very small decals, almost 100 that need to be installed on this model, most of them going on the 4 carriages. I had a number of difficulties that I had to overcome with these decals. First, and not least of which, is that the manufacturer, Carriages, shipped the wrong instructions. I had bought the decals for the 1 in 350 scale model, since that is what I'm building, and the instructions came for the 1 in 35 scale model. My initial thought was this is not such an issue because it's probably the same decal set, just shrunk down, 10 times smaller, but that is not the case. The decal numbering doesn't actually line up. So you might think that having the wrong instructions for the decal set isn't really such an issue. Although that might not sound like a problem, just look at the decals, look at the pictures on the wrong instructions, you should be able to match them up and then put them in the correct place on the model. But the problem is it's not that simple, because the decals themselves are incredibly small. So small in fact that it's quite difficult to identify an individual decal. And that is further complicated by the backing paper that the decals are on being a very light blue, almost white, and the text of the decals themselves being white. So there's a very low contrast between the text and the background, making it even more difficult to identify which decal you're looking for. This was even further complicated by the fact that there are more decals on this little sheet than are actually required. They have provided decals for perhaps another model, or I don't know what they're for. There are so many additional decals that you aren't going to use that are very small, all roughly the same size as the ones that you are going to use. And that makes it quite difficult to match up the decal numbering on the incorrect instructions with the actual decals that you have. After staring at the decal set and the incorrect instructions for some time, I realized that I was going to have to do some more investigation and planning to figure out exactly which decal is which. The first thing I did was take a raw photo of the decal set, as large as I could. I then placed it into some photo editing software and massively increased the contrast and then sharpened the edges as much as possible with the hope of being able to see some letters in these little speckles on the page. And that is this photo that is on screen now. To give you a sense of scale, the big decals in the top left corners, their width is 3mm at the widest. So yeah, if you're having trouble reading them on screen now, just think about how difficult it is to read them on a page with less contrast and softer edges. I then printed out this picture so that I could write numbers on it to correlate the decals to the numbers instruction manual. This still wasn't straightforward. These decals are still too small and too difficult to read even on this enlarged photo that I had to do this through a process of elimination. But I think I got them correct in the end. But even today, I'm not entirely sure that this is the correct decal for the position that I put on the model in the end. But the problems didn't end there, because the instructions for the 1 in 35 scale model actually aren't that good anyway. Even though I had a mapping from 1 in 35 scale instructions to the 1 in 350 scale set that I actually have, I wasn't entirely sure of where I should place those decals. Fortunately, a friend of the channel, Luca, had commented in one of the videos that he had built a 1 in 72 scale Schwerer Gustav, and that meant he had yet another set of instructions different from the 2 that I have, or the 1 that I have and the decal set that I have, and a completed model which could show me where the decals should actually be applied. And I could learn from his experience with installing those decals on his model to actually figure out where these things should go. Unfortunately, it still wasn't that simple. So with all that information, you would think, yay, finally it's all figured out, I now know where to place every single decal, this will go nice and smoothly. No. Because you see, upon looking at Luca's model and the information that he gave me and the instructions from his kit, I realized that the 1 in 35 scale instructions that I had were wrong, and the 1 in 350 decal set that I have was missing certain decals. of all those decals that they gave me, so many of them not to be used. More than half of them, I'd say, not to be used. They couldn't even give me all the correct ones. Fortunately though, these are very small decals, and even if they did give me the correct ones, you probably wouldn't be able to see the difference, even with a magnifying glass, because you can barely read this text anyway. It comes down to this. This gun sits on top of 4 carriers, and each carrier sits on top of 2 carriages. So there are 8 carriages in total, and they should be numbered from 1 to 8. But I only have numbers that go from 1 to 4. Which means that if you look at the number on any given set of carriages, and you compare it to the number on its respective carrier, they won't be correct for how the actual gun was. With all the prep work done, and at this point having at least a pretty good idea of where all the decals should go, I can finally begin applying them to the model. All these decals are printed onto a single piece of decal paper, which means they need to be cut out individually. They are not separated out by the factory. You have to actually cut them out. This does mean that you are required to do some fairly precise cutting on card that's very difficult to see where the boundary between the decal and the backing is on a very small decal. So it's not exactly easy, but it is quite doable. I thought that the actual quality of the decals themselves was quite good with this set. The decal paper is very thin, but also quite strong, and they worked very nicely with Microset. To apply these decals, essentially, I followed the instructions from Microset. Place a little bit of Microset on the paint where you are going to place the decal, then slide the decal off of its backing onto the area that you had previously wiped some Microset over, maneuver it into position, then place some Microset on top of the decal, let the Microset sit for a bit. I didn't let it sit for minutes though, I let it sit for a few seconds, and then press down the decal. To ease myself into the process, I started by applying what are the large decals that go onto the gun support structure. These decals went on very easily, and it gave me quite a lot of confidence to install the rest of them. There are only 8 decals that need to be installed in this part of the model. After installing the decals on the gun support structure, I moved on to installing the decals on the carriages. This is where the majority of the decals are, simply because there are a lot of carriages, and then each carriage has a lot of decals on it. These are also much smaller, which does make them a little bit more tricky to handle, but I found that dipping a decal in the water for even just a second was enough to loosen it from its backing, and that they were very easy to pick up with tweezers and then position in place. In many of the cases, if I wasn't sure of the orientation, I would use a magnifying glass or my camera with maximum zoom so I could actually see how I'd orientated the decal. But in the end, it was surprisingly easy to install even the smallest of the decals. After installing all of the decals on the carriages, I then installed the decals on the carriers. There are just as many decals on the carriers as there are on the carriages, but they are a little bit bigger, which does make it slightly easier. But in the end, the process is exactly the same. This is just a matter of time to work through the very many decals that are in this set. After installing all of the decals and ensuring that they are in their correct position, it's time to seal them in. To seal them in, I overcoat them with X22, the same paint that I used for the glass coat. Obviously, once you have done this, you will not be able to remove the decal, so it is very important that you are happy with their positioning, because you will never get them out after this. You can remove them, but you will destroy them. At that point, you might as well just paint over them if you don't want them anymore. Despite not being able to reposition the decals after they've been overcoated, the advantages of overcoating them are clear. Firstly, they're going to be a lot more durable. The varnish is going to protect the decals in the same way that it protects the paint. Essentially, they won't fall off over time, and they won't be damaged when you handle the model. The other reason why I'm overcoating them is because I do intend to apply panel line to this kit. And if I don't overcoat them, then when I apply the panel line, they will either be damaged or they will fall off. So if you have any intention of weathering a model with decals, you will need to apply an acrylic gloss varnish over them before starting the weathering process. Sealing in the decals with the glass coat is the last thing that I'm going to be doing in this video. I'm only spraying the glass coat over the decals because there's no need to spray it over the rest of the model. I had done that in a previous stage of the build. I'm going to leave the glass coat to dry overnight, and in the next video I'll be able to apply the weathering. If you would like to support this channel or see how this model looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.